Hello everybody, welcome to this first video in our series about how people at the 10 different terrains of consciousness are each responding and reacting to the coronavirus crisis. In today's video, we're going to look at how people at the will-based terrain, pyramid, are coping with this coronavirus situation. So it's really important to understand that people at the will-based terrain pyramid are coming very much from a Wild West mentality. They are very much in fear and in reaction and feeling like it's every man for himself. The world is a dangerous place. The world is out to get me. And the only way I can keep myself safe is amassing power and amassing wealth and amassing the ability to manipulate other people. And if I don't have that ability, I'm going to ally myself with other people who have wealth and have power. And in this terrain, people are very much coming from a place of self-interest, and they're looking after themselves and their own family. And there's not that much attention being paid to the greater needs of society and the common goods of the majority and the running of the system. So in a situation like COVID, which is currently happening, where everybody at Square is banding together for the common good of all and laying down regulations that everyone at Square is following about staying inside and self-isolating and wearing masks, most people at Pyramid are going to be reacting to that. They're not going to like it because they're really much more interested in looking after themselves. So some of the ways that we have seen this play out is in the early stages of the pandemic, where there were a lot of people at Pyramid who were looting, who were hoarding toilet paper and other supplies, because they're really focused on keeping themselves and their own families safe, and their focus is really not on the common good of everybody else. So that's one of the big differences between how people at Pyramid and how people at Square are reacting.
And the reason this is happening is that because as we move across the continuum away from our infinite self, or away from the singularity point of the unity-based terrain infinity, ego becomes more and more prominent. So what we're seeing at the will-based terrain pyramid is exactly what Tahnee is explaining, a much more unleashed ego that is just looking after the I of the self, and in terms of the I being the family, their immediate needs, and just their own survival. So the survival instinct is what's heightened with anyone at Pyramid. And they're not really looking anywhere beyond that. They're just taking care of what they need to take care of in this immediate moment.
And also people at Pyramid, because they're motivated by the instant moment, by instant gratification, and by self-interest, will often be trying to find ways to use this crisis for their own advantage. Now, some people who maybe don't have financial resources are not in the position to do that, so they're just scrambling and looting and hoarding. But people maybe in the wealthier tiers of society who are at Pyramid, who have more resources, who have the luxury to be able to have that kind of thinking, how can I exploit this situation for my own advantage? And we're seeing that play out in lots of different ways around the world, with people who are putting their own interests first, rather than worrying about the effects on the collective and on the society and on the city and on the civilization. They're focused on, how can I turn this to my advantage? How can I make a profit from this at other people's expense? That is the thinking at Pyramid.
And there's even some schools of thinking that some of this has been premeditated by those power brokers at Pyramid. So that's obviously open to discussion. But what we find is that there is a very me first and I-centric and everyone else be damned attitude. And when we look at the higher echelons at Pyramid, you're really looking at the care of their immediate bloodline rather than any other factions of society.
So if you think about empire and domination of one country over another, if you think about monarchy and oligarchy, that kind of thinking is coming from Pyramid. Slavery, it's all about exploitation and seeing other people as pawns in your own game of amassing power. So those pawns might be other people, those pawns might be governments, those pawns might be countries. And so if you are someone who tends to believe in conspiracy stuff, or who tends to believe in the powers that be, and you're trying to analyze those behaviors, you could look at it through this frame of perhaps the people you're studying are at the will-based terrain pyramid. Now, you may not think such people exist, and that's fine. But if you are someone who's looking through that lens, you may find it helpful to read about the will-based terrain pyramid to understand the kinds of thinking that we've seen throughout history of people who have seen others as pawns in their game of amassing power, because that's very much how people at this terrain think.
One thing I'd like to draw our attention to is the understanding that the will-based terrain pyramid is preceding the order-based terrain square, And typically at the order-based terrain square, there's a reaction to the behaviors and the actions of those at the will-based terrain pyramid. But because of the fact that the COVID crisis is really coming from a systemic breakdown at the order-based terrain square, we're seeing that there's a reaction coming the other direction to square and to the laws and to the orders and to the edicts that are coming from that terrain.
And also, because the will-based terrain is a very individualistic terrain, people at Pyramid tend to be quite resistant to authority. They don't tend to obey laws unless they feel that obeying the law is in their best interest. So in a situation like we're seeing now with COVID, these are the people that tend to be ignoring the rules about masks, ignoring the rules about social distancing, going out nightclubbing, going out dancing, walking on the beach, getting drunk, not really obeying the rules because they don't like to follow rules unless they feel like it's somehow serving them.
And a lot of this is a result of the ego invincibility that we see at Pyramid. An extreme example of ego, you see that you're invincible. You don't feel that anything can affect you, and that's why you can drink and smoke and not think that it's going to harm you, and you're just really living for the day and not really caring about tomorrow because you don't think there ever is going to be a tomorrow. The ego doesn't see tomorrow, the ego only sees the now. So part of what we're seeing at Pyramid is an invincibility, an ego invincibility to this COVID virus because the ego doesn't think it's going to be affected. It thinks it can get away with anything, and so there's no concern that it's going to affect me. I'm invincible, I'm immune, I don't have to follow the rules because it doesn't pertain to me. Rules don't pertain to me. At the will-based terrain, it's all about their will. Nothing pertains to them. They do as they will. And so we're seeing behaviors that are very dominated by ego.
And people at Pyramid tend to have a very hedonistic approach to life. They're the kinds of people that will find out that smoking's bad for them, but they'll keep smoking because they live in the moment, they're not thinking long term, and they're always thinking about instant gratification. So if someone's been told to stay home, self-isolate, and they've got the opportunity to go to their beach with their mates and have a few drinks, they're not really going to think about the rules and the best of the common good of the majority. They're going to think about what they want to do in that moment that's most fun for them because they're all about instant gratification. So we're definitely seeing that play out a lot in the current crisis, and the authorities at Square are having to tighten their rules, tighten their lockdown, in the main part because there are so many people at Pyramid who are flouting the law and doing whatever they want.
And another thing we're seeing at Pyramid is a lot of anger because it's a terrain where there's a lot of victim consciousness. There's a great deal of anger at how their life is being destroyed by these collective rules and these collective lockdowns and how these businesses are being shut. They're not really looking at the overall picture. They're just seeing that their life is being impacted and they're really angry. They're feeling like they're being victimized and they're victims of this whole thing. And they want to try and take that out on somebody or take that out somewhere. And so you're seeing a lot of mob violence and a lot of mob reaction as a result of that.
Yeah, because at Pyramid, there's very much a mentality of being hard done by. Everybody's doing stuff to me. It's not fair. And that common thinking at Pyramid is playing out large at the moment. It's not fair that I'm having to be in lockdown. It's not fair that I have to follow these rules. My business is getting ruined. My life's being ruined. And there's not so much thinking about the impact it's having on the society or the impact it's having on the environment or the impact it's having on social systems or the impact it's having on interpersonal relationships around the globe, which is what we're seeing at the other terrains. At Pyramid, it's very much about what's being done to me and it's not fair and I'm a victim, and either they're in charge of that and they're causing this with other people, or they're at the mercy of that and they're the victim of that, and then they're very angry.
And one thing I've been seeing with all of this, basically having the current mob rule going off with Black Lives Matter that has really been tagged onto the COVID crisis. There's a faction that I've been noticing across the world that are a very angry pyramid mob, and now they've taken to the streets, and I've seen videos about how they're just wanting to destroy everything in their path like a bunch of locusts because they're just angry, and they're this anger, this tension, this frustration, this charge is being taken out wherever it can be directed. They really don't know what they're fighting for. They really don't know where their anger is being directed. They just know they're angry and they're just lashing out. And so there's been a big opportunity here for those that want to exploit that to direct that anger and to cultivate that anger, because it's just under the surface boiling and waiting to explode. It's not all the demonstrations, but in particular I've been seeing some Antifa and Black Lives Matter instances where there have been mobs that have been vandalizing, going down streets, basically causing a lot of destruction in their path, going into businesses, being very wanton. They're not peaceful, they're not civil, they're really missing the point of what the message was for the underlying cause that was being argued for. They're just jumping on a bandwagon to vent their frustration and their anger.
Now, it's really important not to look at people at Pyramid as evildoers and the bad guys. I mean, in Hollywood movies, the Pyramid characters are generally the bad guys. Think Sauron, think Voldemort, But in the real world, it's actually more complex than that, because when we take a step back and we look from the perspective of the Fractal-Based Terrain Toroid, and we see that everything's playing out for the highest good of everybody else, and that the collective unfolding is all coming from a higher intelligence, we can see that there actually needs to be some people on the planet that are coming from a place of self-interest so that other people can organize in response to that. If we didn't have that kind of behavior coming from people at Pyramid, there wouldn't be a reason for people at Square to organize into governments, to create systems, to create banking systems, to create legal systems. There wouldn't be people in the world ending slavery. There wouldn't be free thinkers at Diamond. There wouldn't be all the technology that we have. A lot of this is happening in response to people at Pyramid. The whole school of life that we are in requires contrast so that each of us can make our choice how to respond to that. And it's quite possible that many expanded enlightened masters might choose to come back and be reborn at the will-based terrain Pyramid to play this role. It's not a fun role. It's not a role that you're going to get any thanks for in the history books, but it is a role that someone has to play in the collective unfolding for the highest learning and the highest growth of all of us.
And the reason for this is that our shadow is what's expressing across the planet now. And so we're seeing at every terrain the shadow coming to the surface so that we can look at ourself as a collective consciousness, as one indivisible infinite consciousness, and see what choice we want to make going forward for our own prosperity, for our own health and well-being, and for our spiritual evolution. And so what this opportunity is bringing to all of us is a learning that we could not have had any other way.
So that wraps up our first video about the will-based terrain pyramid and how people at that terrain are responding to the coronavirus crisis. We highly recommend you watch our next video, which is all about Square, the order-based terrain, to see how the vast bulk of mainstream society is responding to the coronavirus crisis.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you there.